Picture this, you're 8 years old. It's a Sunday afternoon somewhere in the middle of 1977. Your dad has just finished washing the car on the drive, chamois leather folded over the wing mirror to dry. He opens the door to let it air out and the smell hits you from 6 feet away. Warm vinyl, a trace of oil, something faintly rubbery and mechanical that you couldn't name but you'd know anywhere. You climb in, run your hand across the dashboard, press every button that isn't forbidden. And the thing is, every single one of those buttons and switches and knobs did something specific, something that a British engineer had sat down and thought through, drawn up, tested and fitted to the car on purpose. Not as a luxury, not as a gimmick, as a solution to a real problem that real drivers had on real British roads. We talk a lot about what went wrong with 1970s British cars, the rust, the unreliability, the allegro, but we don't talk nearly enough about what those cars got right. 18 features that were genuinely clever, genuinely useful, and in a handful of cases, genuinely ahead of their time in ways that took the rest of the world another decade to catch up with. Some of these were so good that cars quietly dropped them, and drivers have been worse off ever since. Stay with me, because number 11 is something that modern car designers have been trying to bring back for 30 years and still haven't managed to get right. The reclining front seat sounds obvious until you remember that it wasn't always there. In the early 1960s, most car seats were fixed. You sat where the seat put you, and that was that. By the 1970s, British family cars had worked out the reclining mechanism and fitted it as standard, and the difference it made to long journeys was considerable. A small lever or a rotating handle on the side of the seat, and the backrest would drop backwards in increments. Not just for comfort on the drive, though that was part of it. If you were waiting somewhere, eating a sandwich on a long motorway stop, sitting in a lay-by while the rain hammered the roof, you could let the seat back and actually rest. Your dad would push his all the way back on the ferry crossing to France and sleep for 2 hours with his coat over him while the engine ticked as it cooled. Modern cars still have the same mechanism, but in the 1970s it felt like the car had thought about you as a person, not just a driver. The parcel shelf was a simple idea, executed perfectly. A flat board covered in carpet, sitting across the full width of the car just behind the rear seats, resting above the boot. Hats went on it, maps went on it. The box of chocolates your mum was taking to your nan went on it and got progressively lighter throughout the journey. Children lay across it on long motorway runs, looking up through the rear windscreen at the sky going past. None of this was designed. None of it was in the brochure. The parcel shelf was there for parcels, and the family repurposed it entirely. When hatchbacks started replacing saloons in the 1980s, and the parcel shelf became a flimsy, removable thing on a cord, something was quietly lost. The proper, solid, carpeted shelf of a 1970s saloon was a piece of furniture. You knew exactly what it was for, even when you were using it for something else entirely. Every 1970s British car came with a proper toolkit in the boot, not a tyre inflation canister that expires in 3 years, not a foam sealant kit that patches one puncture and then lives in your garage forever. A jack, a wheel brace and a full-size spare tyre, all clipped or bolted into a recess in the boot floor. The jack was a scissor jack or a bottle jack with a proper handle. The wheel brace was a solid crosshead that gave enough leverage to shift even a wheel that had been on since the previous MOT. You knew where everything was because it lived in the same place every time. And if you got a puncture on the A47 on a Wednesday evening in the rain, you pulled over, got the gear out, and changed the wheel yourself in 20 minutes. That was normal. That was expected. Modern cars give you a space saver spare if you're lucky, a tyre kit if you're not, and the assumption that you'll call someone. The 1970s assumed you'd sort it. The chrome door handles of 1970s British cars were not just decoration. They were substantial. Solid metal curved to fit 4 fingers comfortably, with a mechanism that was almost always reliable because it was almost always simple. You pressed down with your thumb, the latch released, and the door opened. It worked the same way at -5 in January as it did in August. It worked when your hands were dirty. It worked when you were in a hurry. It worked after 20 years of use, because there was nothing complex enough to break. They scratched. They needed polishing. They went dull in the sun and pitted in the salt air near the coast. But they opened the door every single time. The flush-fitted recessed handles that replaced them throughout the 1980s and 1990s looked cleaner and broke inside the door mechanism within 5 years of purchase. The manual choke gets remembered as a frustration, and it was when you got it wrong. But when you understood it, really understood it, the manual choke gave you something no modern car offers. It gave you a conversation with the engine. You pulled it out on a cold morning, turned the key, listened to how the engine caught and adjusted. You could feel whether it needed more or less. You could hear the difference between a cold engine settling and one that was about to flood. Over time, you stopped thinking about it. Your hand just knew. Half out in October, 3/4 in January. The special combination your particular car needed that no manual had ever documented. That knowledge was yours. You'd built it up across 100 cold mornings in a dozen different cars, and it lived in your hands rather than your head. Fuel injection took that away. The car started itself and you had nothing to learn and nothing to know. Bench seats in the front. If your family car in the 1970s had a column gear change, it also had a flat bench seat running the full width of the front cabin. 3 adults across the front. No tunnel, no console, no cup holders or armrests dividing the space into assigned positions. Your mum could slide across and sit close to your dad on a cold morning while the heater woke up. A child could sit in the middle of the front seat on a short trip and feel like they'd been promoted. The gear stick came out of the steering column and the floor was clear. You could step across from the passenger side to the driver's side without getting out of the car. It was a different relationship between the front of the car and the people in it. Closer, less formal, less divided. The center console killed it, and nobody held a funeral. Rear quarter windows. The small separate pane of glass that sat behind the rear door in 4-door saloons gave rear passengers a view that modern cars have quietly removed. In a 1970s Ford Cortina or a Vauxhall Victor, you could look out to the side and slightly behind you through that extra pane of glass. Children pressed their faces against it on long journeys. You could watch the lorry overtaking you from a perspective that the main rear window couldn't give. When cars moved to wrapped rear pillars and smaller glass houses in the pursuit of rigidity and style, those quarter windows disappeared. The cars got stiffer, the pillars got thicker, and the people in the back lost a view they didn't know they'd miss until it was gone. Those first 7 were the ones built into the body and the cabin. But some of the best thinking in 1970s British cars happened in the details. The small things. The things you touched every day without thinking, that worked so well you never had to think about them. The next 11 are the ones that deserve more credit than they ever got. The oil dipstick had a coloured handle. Yellow or orange, always, so you could find it instantly in a dark engine bay without a torch. It sounds like nothing. It was everything. You'd pop the bonnet on a Sunday morning, reach in, and your hand went straight to it. No peering, no torch, no unscrewing the wrong cap, and getting something you weren't expecting on your hands. The coloured handle told you exactly where to look. Modern cars have service interval monitors and electronic oil level sensors and dashboard warnings that tell you things have already gone wrong. They don't have a bright yellow handle in the engine bay that lets you check for yourself in 30 seconds. The dipstick was honest. It showed you what was actually there, rather than what the computer thought ought to be there. The pull-out ashtray in the dashboard of a 1970s British car was a precision item. Spring-loaded, perfectly weighted, it opened with a single push of your thumb and closed with a click that felt deliberate. The interior was metal, not plastic, and the spring mechanism meant it never rattled, even after years of use. Stubbed cigarettes sat in it without rolling around. The lid sealed it. When it was full, you pulled the whole tray out of its housing, emptied it, and slid it back in. Simple, clean, considered. As smoking declined and cars stopped fitting ashtrays, the cubbyhole or coin tray that replaced it was never as well made. It was a plastic cup with straight sides, open at the top, and it held nothing securely and rattled on every B road in Britain. The vent windows on the front doors, those little triangular quarter lights that pivoted open, were the most intelligent piece of car ventilation ever fitted to a British family car. You twisted the catch, angled the glass into the airflow, and aimed a column of fresh air directly at your face without opening the main window. You didn't get road noise, didn't get your hair destroyed. You didn't have to wind anything down or up, you just aimed it. In traffic on a warm day, you could sit with your window closed, and the quarter light cracked at the right angle, and feel the air moving across you without the car turning into a wind tunnel. Air conditioning made them unnecessary, and the aerodynamicists said they created drag. Both things were probably true. Neither of them is a good enough reason for what was lost. The fascia-mounted map light, a small bulb set into the dashboard or the headlining above the passenger seat, shining downward onto a specific area, designed so a passenger could read a map in the dark without lighting up the whole car and blinding the driver. It was positioned carefully. It was angled correctly. It understood that navigating at night while someone else drove was a real task that needed a real solution. Your mum would fold the map to the right section, hold it under that small yellow light, trace the route with her finger, and say turn left at the roundabout before it appeared. That was the navigation system. One bulb above the passenger seat, and someone who knew how to read a map. It worked reliably for several decades, which is better than some sat-nav units managed in their first year of production. The full-size external door mirror on a 1970s British car was bolted to the front of the door, right at the top of the A-pillar, positioned so you could see past it completely when it wasn't in use, and use it without losing much of the road in front. It was a single flat glass in a metal housing, adjusted by hand from outside the car before you set off. You opened the door, stood on the sill, and moved the mirror to where you needed it. Once it was right, it stayed right, because the mechanism that held it was stiff enough to keep its position. It didn't fold electrically. It didn't heat itself. It didn't have a camera built into it. It showed you what was behind you. It held its position in motorway crosswinds. And if someone clipped it on a narrow lane, you bent it back with your hand. That was the entire maintenance requirement for the life of the car. The handbrake in a 1970s British car was a long lever between the front seats, or, in some models, a fly-off handbrake mounted directly beside the driver's right hand, designed to be released at speed with a single downward push rather than a button press. The fly-off type was a motorsport feature that found its way into road cars, and once you understood how it worked, it felt natural and quick. Pull it up to hold on a hill. Push the lever down to release and move off cleanly. It gave you more control on a slope than anything that came after it. The electronic handbrake that replaced the lever in modern cars is technically more sophisticated and practically more annoying in almost every situation involving a hill start in traffic. Every driver who grew up with a proper handbrake knows this and won't say it in front of anyone under 30. The rubber overrider bumpers on cars like the Mini and the early Metro were a piece of genuine practical thinking. Hard rubber ends capping the front and rear bumpers, designed to take the minor contact of tight car park manoeuvring and emerge undamaged. You could touch a wall or nudge a bollard at walking pace, and the rubber absorbed it without marking either surface. Parking in 1970s Britain meant parking close. Streets were narrow, bays were small, people nudged things regularly, and nobody considered it a disaster. The rubber overrider made contact survivable. The chrome everything aesthetic of the 1980s and the plastic-cladded bumpers of the 1990s both looked better and cost more to damage. A modern car can write off a bumper at 4 miles an hour in a supermarket car park. A Mini with rubber overriders would have laughed at it. Interior door pulls in 1970s. British cars were recessed handles set into the door card, curved to fit a hand naturally, shaped so that you gripped from underneath and pulled. They were padded. They were at the right height. They were wide enough to get your fingers around with winter gloves on. They were strong enough that a child could haul themselves up by one without anything flexing. The armrest was often integrated into the same piece, so the door card served as both something to hold while pulling the door and something to rest your elbow on while driving. Modern cars separate these functions, put them at slightly wrong heights, use materials that creak, and ergonomists argue about placement while ordinary drivers just wish they could get a proper grip on their door again. The temperature gauge in the centre of the dashboard of every 1970s British saloon was an analogue dial with a needle that moved in real time. Cold, warming, normal, hot. You watched it. You knew what normal looked like on your car, because every car ran slightly differently, and your gauge sat at slightly different position at the right temperature. If the needle moved, you noticed because you knew where it usually sat. That relationship between driver and gauge was ongoing, active, and occasionally life-saving. The temperature warning light that replaced it in modern cars is binary. It's fine or it isn't. There's no slope, no early signal, no chance to pull over before the damage is done. The needle was a conversation. The warning light is an argument you've already lost. The boot light was triggered by a simple push switch mounted in the boot surround, pressed down by the lid when closed and released when opened. The bulb was positioned to illuminate the whole boot floor, not just one corner. It was bright enough to find what you needed and simple enough never to fail. You opened the boot on a dark evening outside the supermarket and everything was visible immediately. The spare wheel cover, the toolkit, whatever your dad had stacked in there, the bag of shopping you were trying to reach. Modern boots have sensors that can misread when the lid is ajar. Some turn the light on while driving and flatten the battery. Some are positioned so poorly they light the lid rather than the floor. The 1970s boot light came on when the boot was open and went off when it closed. It had no ambitions beyond that, and it never failed at them. And then there was the heater, not the blower that passed for heating in some earlier cars, where the air came in from outside and got slightly less cold as it passed a small matrix and arrived at your feet lukewarm and smelling of petrol. The proper 1970s British car heater, fitted in something like a Rover SD1 or a Triumph 2500, was a two-zone system that directed warm air to the windscreen, to the footwells, and to the fascia vents independently. You could demist the windscreen while warming your feet while having cool air at face level. The controls were simple: a dial for temperature, a dial for the fan speed, a set of levers for directing the flow. Nothing was automatic, nothing adjusted itself, but nothing was hidden either. You set what you wanted and the car delivered it, and if it wasn't right, you moved a lever. The knowledge of how to get warm in a specific car was personal knowledge, built up over the first winter you owned it. Your car, your heater, your settings, nobody else needed to know them. 18 features, some of them clever, some of them simple, some of them so obvious in hindsight that it's hard to understand why they ever went away. But that's what 1970s British cars were. Not perfect, not reliable in the ways that mattered, but thought about. The engineers who designed them had all driven on British roads, in British winters, in British traffic, and they built solutions for the problems they knew from the inside. The reclining seat, the proper spare, the coloured dipstick handle, the quarter light aimed straight at your face on a warm afternoon. The heater you learned to set by feel over one cold season and never had to think about again. None of it was sophisticated by the standards we apply now. All of it worked. And if you close your eyes and put yourself back in the front seat of a 1970s Cortina or an Allegro or a Rover or a Marina, with the heater going and the radio crackling and the temperature gauge sitting exactly where it always sat, you know exactly what I mean. If any of this brought back a memory, share it in the comments. Which feature do you remember most? Which one hit you the second I mentioned it? Share this with someone who'd remember it too. Please subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive.